Hey guys, so today's lesson is all about invasive species. And this is a pretty relevant topic right now if you guys have heard anything about murder hornets, which are a new invasive species to Canada. So let's get into it. Okay, so like I said, this is all about invasive species. So we're going to be looking at what the difference is between an invasive species and a native species. Then we're going to look at some of the impacts of invasive species and talk about how they threaten biodiversity. So native species are also called indigenous species, and they are any species that are naturally found in a certain region or got to that region through natural means, like that species' own emigration to that area. In North America, we consider an organism to be native to the area if it was present here prior to colonization. And we can determine this by looking at fossil records for a lot of different animals or seed records for different plants. And then we can date those fossils and those seeds. Native species will be really well adapted to the conditions of that area since they have evolved in that area for a really long period of time. And they'll also fill a specific niche within that ecosystem or a specific role. An invasive species is sometimes also called an introduced species, an alien species, or an exotic species. And these are organisms that are not native to the area. They've been introduced to that area, either intentionally or accidentally, through human activity. And they always cause some sort of detriment or negative impact on the region they've been introduced to. One of the reasons that they tend to be so detrimental is that when they get introduced to a new region, they have no natural predators there. And therefore, they tend to be able to spread really quickly. There's nothing that controls their population as well. And they tend to be able to outcompete a lot of the native species, but we'll get into more of that. So these are some characteristics of invasive species. Like I said, they have no natural predators in that new area, also no pathogens in that area, so like diseases. So because of that, they have limited population control. They also tend to be able to reproduce and grow very quickly. They tend to be able to produce a lot of young, so their population grows really fast. They're usually like an R-selected species as opposed to a K-selected species. They're also almost always generalists, meaning that they're able to tolerate a really wide range of environmental conditions, and they're not picky about what they eat or what kind of habitat they live in. They also tend to disperse really effectively or spread very effectively. That's how they become an invasive species a lot of the time. And then lastly, they tend to be really strong competitors, which is why they're often able to outcompete native species for access to resources. So we're going to look at some of the different negative impacts of invasive species, and these impacts can fall into three main categories: economic impacts, social impacts, and environmental impacts. So the economic impacts just comes from any loss of money that humans experience because of that invasive species being there. So sometimes the invasive species can damage human infrastructure, which can be expensive to repair. Sometimes they kill off crops, and then trying to control that invasive species so that you don't lose all your crops can be really expensive. They often reduce the productivity of farming, agriculture, and or fishing. They also result in different trade restrictions. So you might not be able to like export your product to different countries because they're afraid of some sort of invasive species that you have being spread to them. They also can reduce tourism, which can have economic impacts on areas that rely on tourism. The social impacts are that they can bring new diseases to an area. They can cause people to reduce their travel. again, because they're afraid of going somewhere that might have that invasive species and therefore new disease. They can impact recreational activities. So you might not be able to swim or boat in that lake anymore because of an invasive species, or you might not be able to go hiking on that trail anymore because of an invasive species, that kind of stuff. And then they can also bring new allergies or irritants to an area. So one example of this is the West Nile virus. That was an invasive disease that came to North America that people were really afraid of. Another example of this would be like zebra mussels. So zebra mussels are more of an issue in Southern Ontario, where I'm from, than in Alberta. But essentially, like in most lakes now, you can't leave your boat in the water or it will get covered in zebra mussels. And you can't just walk into the water without like water shoes on because the bottom of your feet will get all cut up by the zebra mussels. So that kind of stuff. And then lastly, environmental impacts, which is usually the biggest area of impact for invasive species. And we're going to look at three kind of subcategories of environmental impacts. We're going to look at how invasive species impact the community structure of the ecosystem, how the ecosystem functions, and then biodiversity. So like I said, native species are often outcompeted by the invasive species because that invasive species doesn't have any predators or anything. And so a lot of the time, the native species will become extinct in that ecosystem, which of course is going to disrupt all of the different interactions and food webs between different species within that ecosystem, not just the one that was outcompeted. About half of North America's endangered species have seen a decline in their population as a direct result of invasive species. So they have a huge impact on community structure. Invasive species can also alter how an ecosystem functions because they are going to essentially go in and start taking over either entire niches or parts of niches from other species. As the native species is outcompeted and die, sometimes part of their role in that ecosystem, part of their niche, can remain empty because the invasive species might have taken over the part of their niche that had to do with how they ate, but it might not have taken over some of their other roles in that ecosystem. This can lead to things like soil degradation and erosion, especially if it is a plant species that we're talking about losing. They can also change how nutrients are cycled through that ecosystem and how energy flows through that ecosystem. And when we're talking about energy, what we're really talking about there is the food web. And then lastly, biodiversity. This is the kind of biggest fear that we have around invasive species, is their negative effect on biodiversity. A lot of the time when you have an invasive species introduced to an area, what you're really worried about is the extinction or extirpation of your native species. And then as soon as you start losing species from your ecosystem, that results in a loss of biodiversity. Just so you know, to kind of define some of these terms, extinction refers to when a species dies off and no longer exists on Earth. Extirpation means that that species dies off in that area, but they might still exist somewhere else on the planet. There are four main ways that invasive species can decrease biodiversity: through competition, predation, pathogens, and hybridization. So competition is one that we talk about a lot. Again, the fact that invasive species populations can grow much more so than native species populations because they don't have any predators. And the fact that they tend to be generalists tend to mean that they can like spread out over an ecosystem really, really quickly. And then, like I said, they also tend to be really good competitors. So as soon as they start accessing food or other resources more easily than the native species, that native species starts dying off. So at the top here, we have an example of the purple loosestrife, which is an invasive plant species, which is really good at spreading, and it tends to outcompete other plants for sunlight because it can grow really quickly. And it also tends to outcompete them for nutrients because it has a really complex root system. And then over here, all of these little tiny things are an invasive mussel species. I actually think these are zebra mussels. And this larger one is a native mussel species. And mussels are filter feeders, so they filter the water. They kind of like suck the water into themselves and then filter out microorganisms and stuff like that to eat. In this case, all of these tiny zebra mussels would be filtering the water before it gets to the larger native mussel. And so by the time the water gets to the larger native mussel, it has already made its way through all the zebra mussels. There's no microorganisms left in it, and that native mussel will start to. And then predation is just when an invasive species directly predates on a native species, so it eats the native species. Native species won't have any defense mechanisms against an invasive species since they didn't co-evolve, which means evolve together. This results in the decline of the native population and can lead to extinction or extirpation as well. Many flightless bird species have gone extinct because of predation from invasive species. In Australia and stuff like that, they've lost almost all of their flightless bird species as a direct result of invasive species eating them. And yeah, it's happened to a lot of species. We've got two examples at the top here. This one is a python that is eating either a crocodile or an alligator, I don't know. Pythons are a really common invasive species in the Florida Everglades. They were introduced there when people had pythons as pets and then got sick of them or couldn't take care of them anymore and released them into the Florida Everglades. And now they actually grow big enough to eat the crocodiles or alligators that are there. Then we have pathogens, where you have an invasive species with bringing essentially a new disease to an area, and then that disease can affect either the native species of that area or humans, or in some cases both. That can obviously kill off the native species, can also kill off crops or habitat or stuff like that. This example here at the top is a disease that it's called like white nose disease or something like that. It affects bats, and it's this like fungus that grows around their nose, and it causes them to wake up early from hibernation in the winter, and then because there's not a lot of insects flying around in the winter, the bats tend to starve to death. And then the last one is hybridization, which is anytime two different species mate and produce viable offspring. We call it a hybrid that is formed. And so if you introduce an invasive species to an area, there's a chance that it might be able to mate with some of the native species there. And if they produce a hybrid, that might mean that, you know, in however many generations, you might only have hybrids left, and you might not have any just purebred native species left. So in that way, you kind of lose that native species. So we've talked about the impacts of invasive species. I'm going to briefly touch on how they spread to new areas. Like I mentioned previously, it can be either accidental or intentional. In the past, we did spread a lot of invasive species on purpose before we really understood the impacts of invasive species. But nowadays, most introductions are unintentional. However, with an increase in globalization, trade, travel, all of that kind of stuff, there is a lot of unintentional spread that is still happening. Lots of species get spread to areas that they don't belong, most of them don't become invasive. Most of them just die when they get to a habitat that they haven't evolved to live in. And some of them will survive but won't become harmful. And if they're not harmful, they're not considered invasive. So very few species that get introduced to a new area actually become invasive, but enough of them do that it's definitely an issue. So intentional introduction would be like, for instance, dumping bait buckets. So if you are going fishing and you take some live bait to the lake, and then whatever you don't use, you dump into the lake, you could be introducing an invasive species to that lake. Releasing species into the wild, like if you had a pet python that you didn't like, or you had like a plant in your garden and you got sick of it and dug it up and tossed it across the road. Other times, especially in the past, we imported a lot of animals for human use from Europe, and they became invasive. So pigeons is an example of that. We introduced cats to Australia. That's what ate a lot of their flightless birds. There's been like cane toads that were introduced to try and like eat mice, and they ended up becoming invasive. Like wild hogs, like wild horses. There's tons of stuff that have been introduced because we thought we could use them. Importing plants for gardening or landscaping. So if you want like an ornamental plant that you think looks pretty, but it's not from around here, and then you introduce it into your garden and it seeds spread. Biocontrol, which is an interesting one. Biocontrol is when you introduce a species into a ecosystem to control the population of a different species. And this sometimes can be used to control invasive species. So if you have one invasive species, you might go back to that invasive species' original habitat, find its predator, and then introduce that predator to your ecosystem as well. Hopefully, that predator will only eat the original invasive species, but many times that predator will also eat your native species, in which case that predator then also becomes invasive. And the last one is cultural release, like releasing butterflies at weddings or releasing like doves, that kind of stuff that you're like doing for like symbolic reasons, but still isn't a good idea. Unintentional introduction, again, this is the big one nowadays. A really common one is ballast water. So ballast water is essentially when you have like a ship that's going to travel like across the ocean. The ship might take in water, like in Asia, and then come over to Canada and then release that water. And the ballast water is to like control how heavy the ship is, how deep it sits in the water. So if it's like empty coming over here and it's going to be full going back, then it would fill its ballast water in Asia, come over here, dump it out as it gets its cargo. And lots of organisms can get sucked into that ballast water, survive the trip, and then get dumped out over here. So sea lamprey is an example of an invasive species that we have here in Canada that was transported in ballast water. The movement of wood products is another big one. Lots of invasive insects have traveled to and from different countries in lumber and stuff like that, like the like ash borer, the Asian longhorn beetle, like that kind of stuff. Different packing material can just hide a lot of invasive species. Changing waterways, moving equipment like boats or hiking boots or ATVs. That's why in a lot of places now they will ask you, like, before you put your boat in this lake, wash it off. Don't transport firewood from another campsite to here. Even if you go like hiking on a trail in the woods, you should like wash your boots before you take them hiking somewhere else, that kind of stuff. moving wildlife, the escape of non-native wildlife. So this has happened before where like labs and stuff like that have been experimenting on an organism of some type and then accidentally released it, and then moving topsoil. So anytime you're like moving living things or rocks or mud or dirt or whatever, or water, you're at risk of transporting an invasive species. Okay, so that's it. I hope you found that interesting. Let me know if you have any questions.